Lighting. 3, 2, 1.
Good morning, everyone. We'll give everyone a second to hop onto the Zoom and then we'll get started. All right, well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's Research America Alliance discussion. Thank you so much for joining us on Zoom today and for your partnership in the Research America Alliance. If your organization is not a member, we invite you to stay as our guest, but please get in touch with my colleague, Joel. He's happy to connect with you to discuss the value that comes with being an Alliance member organization, and his email is in the chat now. Today, we are very pleased to be joined by Tish Hevel, CEO of the Brain Donor Project. Tish will help us today illuminate the process of brain donation, dispel the myths surrounding it, and tell us how to help be the brain behind the breakthrough. As always, please type your questions into the Q&A box or chat, and we will pose as many as we can during the Q&A portion of today's session. And thank you so much for joining us, Tish. And with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks for having me, Sam. I really appreciate it. And thank you, everyone, for being a part of this. I'm here today because brain donation has actually become a very urgent situation. And it's urgent for two reasons. One is that 1 in 5 of us already has some kind of neurologic disease or disorder. And secondly, it's going to get a lot worse. Our chances of being diagnosed with a neuro disorder increase as we age. And as you all know, we're living longer than ever. So you can see where this is headed, and the burden is going to be tremendous. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now. There we go. So the biggest problem with brain donation right now is that not enough people know about it, or they have misconceptions that really kind of getting in the way. The first one is that if you've checked the box for organ donation, it includes brain donation. And that is not the case. Separate arrangements need to be made, or that body donation is the same thing. That's not true either. The brain and anatomical body donation, the brain is not used for neuroscience research, and everybody agrees it's more valuable for that. Another one is that only diseased brains are needed. That couldn't be more wrong, because healthy brains, so-called controls or ones without a neurologic disorder, they are critical to comparative science and needed in every single study. It's also not disfiguring, so an open casket is still an option. And when donating to the National Institutes of Health, the brain banks of the NIH, which we support as their contracted outreach partner, there is no cost to the family. So a lot of people are like, how did you learn all this? And I'm just going to say we learned it the hard way. Meet my dad. When he was diagnosed with Lewy bodies dementia back in 2014, we made arrangements to donate his brain, even though it was super complicated. And then we talked to a lot of people about it. Friends and family wanted to understand it better and get things started for themselves. So long story short, that's how the Brain Donor Project got started 7 years ago. And right away, we realized 2 big benefits. One of them is, sounds corny, but I hear it from lots of families. There is a powerful sense of comfort that comes from a great loss and knowing that something positive will come from it. And the second one is illustrated by this. This is enhanced histology images of my dad's brain. So the family gets a copy, not necessarily of this, but the neuropathology report if they request it of the brain bank. And that's really important information. It sort of describes any diagnoses found in the brain, the region of the brain that was impacted, and the stage of the disease. So I'm told this slide clearly shows the proteins that are the hallmark of Lewy bodies dementia. So someday when we know more about the underpinnings of a lot of these, especially neurodegenerative diseases, that'll be important information for his kids and grandkids to have. So after all that, the Brain Donor Project was formed to further the science of supporting science. We exclusively support the brain banks of the NIH, which is called the Neurobiobank. Currently, there are 5 locations that support the public: Mount Sinai in New York, Harvard, University of Maryland at Baltimore, University of Miami in Florida, and one at UCLA. There's also one not pictured here that's at the University of Pittsburgh, and it just works with the medical examiner's office. Even though they're kind of spread out on the edges, these brain banks can recover from anywhere in the US. So a little background on the Neurobiobank, just so you understand who you're working with here. The NIH got into the brain banking business, let's say, about 9 years ago because neuroscience researchers were having trouble getting the tissue they needed from privately held brain banks. So this is the nation's only federated network of brain banks, and it was developed expressly to help provide better access for researchers. It also supports academia as well as industry around the world. It accepts diseased brains and so-called controls. For researchers, it's a very incredible resource. If you go to their website at neurobiobank.nih.gov, part of the website is, oh, you're here because you want to be a brain donor. That's great. We need you really bad. Links to us to start the process for that. But for the researchers, they enter their credentials and the details of their study to get access to the portal. And then they consider what samples they need from more than 15,000 subjects. It's name a disorder, age-matched controls. They request what they need. They get an answer within a couple of business days and only pay shipping. So it is a really fantastic resource to neuroscience. For the Brain Donor Project, the focus is on simplifying the process to become a brain donor, as well as raising awareness. So the way we simplified it is by creating this website, and a visit to that page gets things started. So all kinds of info, there's a robust FAQ section, and when you're ready, you can go to the brain pre-registration button in the upper right-hand corner and complete a brief online form. So in a perfect world, if death is not imminent, we go ahead and send the brain bank's registration forms to the individual. We do that either by snail mail or US mail, whichever the user has chosen. And then we effectively hand off the relationship to the brain bank, and they explain what happens at time of death. And it's at that point that the family plays a really critical role. So the brain banks then ask the family to notify very quickly upon death. They'd like to know about the passing within the hour. So the brain bank then arranges transport of the body to the place where the procedure happens. And typically that's the family's funeral home these days. The brain bank then sends a pathologist there or recovery specialist to remove the brain through the back of the head, again, not disfiguring. And then they ship it to the brain bank. Again, all of that's at no cost to the family. And then the body is technically released to proceed with whatever burial or cremation plans will be taking place. So that's how it works at time of death. So to give you an idea of who's deciding to be brain donors with us these days, nearly 18,000 people have already started the process. What's interesting is about 40% of them are controls. So these are people that are just, they're not sick, but they want to help advance science, which is wonderful. Wide age span, they come from all 50 states. And at the moment, the ones that do have reported diagnosis represent more than 200 different categories of neurologic disorders. So we work with a lot of patient advocacy groups and end-of-life professionals to try to get the word out for this. And when we're lucky, we get some earned media that helps us really spread the word. In 2018, we were featured in National Geographic, which led to many pre-registrations. And last year we were on NPR Science Friday, which aired on 400 radio stations across the country. So that helped too. Shortly after that, in March of last year, we co-hosted a briefing of the Congressional Neuroscience Caucus, and co-chair Earl Blumenauer introduced a resolution naming May 7th National Brain Donation Awareness Day. Happens to be my dad's birthday. So we'll be marking that occasion soon this year, and we would love it if anybody on the call, especially those of you who are involved with other patient advocacy groups, would consider helping amplify our message by checking out our toolkit on the site. That would be fantastic. So our ask is for people to consider another aspect of your legacy. Many of us give a whole lot of thought and pay a lot of attention and take some time considering what's going to happen to our stuff, or if we have some, our money, and where we'd like all that to go. But remember that you're also in a position to give away a very valuable gift. So please consider brain donation and register for that in advance and talk to your family so that they can see to your wishes. I'm going to stop sharing now because I want to read in closing part of a letter that we just got the other day. This is from a woman in Idaho who responded to our request to share their stories of brain donation. She says, "My story is about 13 women I love. I'll start with my mother. After many years of confusion, followed by anger, confusion, then anger, she was diagnosed with vascular dementia. She had never smoked, didn't have diabetes, was a lifelong athlete with a busy social life. But even though she played in 2 weekly bridge clubs, she stopped recognizing a good hand of cards. She had handled the budget for a high school for 30 years, but now was stumped by elementary problems like 8 take away 5. We didn't know what's going on inside her head, and neither did the doctors. They could predict her decline, but they didn't know how to stop it. Her regression wasn't totally foreign to me. Both of my grandmothers had engaged in what other family members called crazy talk for a few years before their deaths in nursing homes. My father's 3 sisters all told weird stories and showed confusion about simple things as their lives ended. My mother's only sister died demented in a nursing home. The exceptional women of my family, a school board chairwoman, a real estate agent, a teacher, a golf champion, mothers who raised a total of 29 children. Their accomplishments were overshadowed and their final years were spent bewildered." She continues, "My motives may be purely selfish. I have 2 younger sisters and 2 daughters and 2 granddaughters. Last month, as I held my daughter's 6-week-old little girl for the first time, I must admit the thought crossed my mind. What lies ahead for all of us if science and medicine don't learn more about dementia? I discovered that checking the organ donor box on your driver's license doesn't include providing brain tissue for study, and they can't get enough answers from inside your head while you're still alive. That is why I filled out the paperwork to donate my brain." Okay, Sam, back to you on that note.
Wow. Well, thank you so much, Tish. And
Oh.
what a moving characterization of why it's so important,
I know.
why brain donation is such an important facet of scientific research. So I'm going to start with a few questions that came to mind as you were speaking myself, but I'll remind our audience to please post any questions that you have into the chat or Q&A. So we now know that brain donation is separate from body donation, but can you do both?
Yeah, you can do both. It's a little tricky, but we were able to do it with my dad. So the first thing you should always do is register to donate your brain, no matter what your situation. Not just my bias. Everyone agrees that brain is terribly critical and valuable for neuroscience research. Then the trick is to find a body donation program in your area. It has to be local because they don't ship the bodies to other places intact like that. So the best way to do that is to conduct an online search for body donation programs in blank. But then you have to call them because they don't put on their website a critical piece of information, and that is, will they accept a body for anatomical study once the brain has been removed for neuroscience research elsewhere? Some do, some don't. And I don't really understand the logic of that, but if you can find one in your part of the world, it's really kind of a cool thing. When when my dad passed, we were living in northern Cincinnati, kind of in between Cincinnati and Dayton. And so when he passed, we called the body donation program to which he was registered, which was in Dayton. They came and picked him up, brought him there, removed his pathologist, met him there. They removed his brain, shipped it to the brain bank, and then kept his body there for anatomical study. And so there's something that we felt really good about, that all his parts were being used for research. And that's a powerful feeling when you've suffered a great loss, thinking, okay, well, at least we're all going to realize something good out of that. So yeah, it's doable, but it's tricky.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you.
Sure.
So how do we stipulate brain donation in legal documents, in wills, trusts, medical directives, et cetera?
That's a great question, because I get that from attorneys all the time who write or call and say, hey, I'm helping this person with, their end of life planning, and just give me the wording for what needs to go in these documents. And I'm like, I wish it was that simple. It's not. For one thing, no one's going to read wills until it's way too late to arrange for what you're trying to do. So it's not a matter of simply putting something in an end of life document. If it's something you want to see through, which is the only reason to do it, right? You have to pre-register in advance and then talk to your family. The family plays such a critical role. If they don't notify or notify in time, it won't take place, So we try to explain to people it's not quite that simple, but here's what, the actual pre-registration process is simple, but it's just not a part of that paperwork. It's a different set. And then you have to make sure that is kept, delivered to family in advance and kept someplace where people will get their hands on it immediately, so they know what number to call.
So along those lines, what kind of paperwork is needed after you pass to make the donation possible?
So there's not a lot, because you pre-register on our site. And then from that information, we determine which of the brain banks the individual goes to. Like I said, if it's in a perfect world, so if we're not in a hurry, we go ahead and send the registration forms. The person fills those out and sends them back into the brain bank. And then that's who their relationship with. That's who their relationship is with. Then the brain bank provides information about what to do. So the paperwork part really is kind of nominal. At that point, they just, the family needs a phone number, and they send along some additional information just so they understand the process of what happens at time of death. And then also at time of death, there's one last consent that is given over the phone. So they do need to talk to a family member. Doesn't have to be the medical POA or whoever, but a close next of kin to give the final consent. And so there's, once things are planned, there's not a lot of paperwork afterwards.
The process is relatively simple, but it's important to know the steps of the process.
Absolutely.
It happens in a timely manner.
Absolutely. And as far as in advance as you can do it is great, because, we are able, the brain banks are able to accommodate sometimes an imminent situation or somebody who has very recently passed. But the problem is, it's kind of the same timetable as organ donation, so that the brain needs to be back at the brain bank, stored properly, ideally in way under 24 hours. So if it's going to exceed that, if there's a possibility that it will exceed that, they can't. And it's because, the structure of the tissue changes such that it's just not viable for research. So, it's such a, it's such a thing that's so time bound that anything you can do in advance. Also, they work very hard to attach whatever data is available on that brain to it, so to speak, in the portal. So part of the the registration process includes the family or the individual signing medical records releases, so that when the person passes, they don't execute that medical records release until death, so that it's a complete record. Mm-hmm. And so they use that, and they use a lot of other things, sometimes even interviews with the family, to come up with what is the final consensus diagnosis. Neuropathology is part of that. A lot of other tests are part of that. And then the brain is characterized or categorized as an X-year-old man or woman with X disease, so that when the researcher goes into the portal and he or she is looking for that brain would be available for that person, for that study. Make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Sure.
Well, I want to switch gears just a little bit. Since we are a research-focused organization, I'm curious about the research implications. Of course, the benefits of brain donation abound, but can multiple research areas directly benefit from a single brain donation?
Sorry, but yeah, I mean, an individual brain can be used for all kinds of studies, and especially control brains. I mean, from different regions of the brain and everything that can be used in dozens and dozens of studies. So yeah, and you know, I'm not a scientist, so here's what I do know. I do know that there are so many, there's so much interest right now in the genetic underpinnings of so many neurologic diseases. And just by the things that are happening now, you can tell we're not that far away from being able to understand a lot of the gene anomalies that cause certain situations. And once you get there, it's not that much of a leap to be able to conduct the kind of gene editing that can eradicate a disease within a family. And the implications of that are tremendous. It's already happening with some diseases like Huntington's disease and some others where they've isolated, figured out how to modify, found a way to introduce that, and we're there. So anything with a genetic component, and that's like almost everything neuro, almost, I feel like we're getting so much closer, you know. In the meantime, we're not there yet. And so the idea of treatments and diagnostic work, you know, hasn't progressed as fast as everybody needs it to, not just wants it to. And so that's why this tissue is so critical. There's no substitute for it. They haven't figured out how to run it through a 3D printer and come up with something that helps the, you know, do the same thing for researchers. And so that's what makes this, you know, they keep advancing so much technology, whether it's imaging or other kinds of work. But the point is they don't know where to point those things, or they're not sure what to do with those things until they have brain tissue for their studies. I feel like I went off on a tangent there, but did I answer your question? Okay, good.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay.
And perfectly elaborated on the critical need for brain donations.
Good.
So we have a ton of audience engagement, but before we get to the audience questions, I have one last question for you. It's my favorite question, really. How can advocates like those on this call help support the work of the Brain Donor Project?
Oh, thanks for asking that. That's a great question. We love to help educate people's communities about this need, about how to do it, and about why it's important. So we provide webinars like this. We provide copy for e-newsletters. We provide copy so that you can put some information and a link in the resources part of the website. As I mentioned before, we're going to be making some noise about National Brain Donation Awareness Day on May 7th. And so there's a toolkit available on our site for that. We love the opportunity to be able to tell people about this. And the main reason is this: we've kind of learned that, you know, these misconceptions, I think, are what holds up people really participating in brain donation. They think they've already done it, and they haven't yet, you know. And so once people understand a little bit about the critical need for this and why it's so important, our experience has been that any objections just kind of fall away. You know, our attitudes about death have really evolved. And so, you know, if people feel like, well, I'm finished with it, and if it's important for another purpose, sure. So that's my biggest challenge right now, is to make sure the world can understand more about this need. And then here's another thing to keep in mind. There's a giant study called the Brain Initiative that was started during, I think, the first Obama administration. And it's a multi-stakeholder thing to help us create better tools to understand the brain. It's really kind of revolutionary. They're now at the point in that study where they are doing what they refer to as an atlasing of every cell of the brain. And so for this, they're going to need significant amounts of so-called unaffected control brains across every single demographic axis. So think about this for a minute, because I have. That means these are people that are not dying of a neuro cause, right? So many of them will die from accidents, especially the younger people on this spectrum. It's my big fear that the first time some people will learn about brain donation is when they're being asked to consent to donate the brain of someone they love, and they haven't even gotten their arms around the fact that they're gone yet. That's terrible. That's so terrible as to be cruel, A, and B, our chances of getting someone agreeing to that under those circumstances are not ideal, you know?
Mhm.
So I appreciate the thought that we could use a lot of help with that. And if anybody wants to contact and see what we can do, I'd be delighted to share the things that we can produce for different audiences.
Absolutely, absolutely. And we're happy to help in that process as well.
Thank you. You guys are doing great. I really appreciate it. This is awesome.
All right, well, we do have quite a few audience questions, so I'm going to ask my colleague Jacqueline to join us on screen and pose a few of those.
Great.
Great. Thank you, Sam. And thank you, Tish, so much for this discussion. It's you're very passionate about the issue, and it's great to raise awareness and inform everybody about this. So first question from the audience. Wish I knew about this before her dad passed, especially for the ability to get the neuro report. Thanks for spreading the word. Do you go to elder care facilities and talk with families?
We do. We've done seminars at a lot of different places that are homes for aging people. So yeah, you know, that's, and interestingly, most of the people who do pre-register are on the older end of the spectrum. And if you think about it, that kind of makes sense, because they're, you know, they're at the stage in their life where they're planning for their death and they're starting to think about that. But yeah, the trick too is also, you know, they need brains across the lifespan. You just, you know, every day's a gift to everybody. We don't know. And so if you haven't thought about this, it's important to, otherwise your family won't know what your wishes are. But yeah, we do try to get the word out that way.
Great. Thank you.
Sure.
Next question. Tish, can you share the elevator pitch, what we should say if we only have a short window to make the case to our friends and family?
That's a good question. When people ask me about it, I say there's a critical need for it in research, because we're not getting answers fast enough for brain donation. In brain disease. So what we're doing is encouraging people to make plans now to donate their brains when they die, because research requires it, and we won't get where we need if they don't. I don't know if that was fast enough, but that's kind of the thing, you know, once you're finished with your parts, they can really use them. And if you haven't thought about how to make that happen, it's time to do that.
I think that was
Thank you. All right, next question. How is responsible treatment of the donated brains by researchers ensured? Human remains have sadly often been mistreated historically by researchers.
Yeah, there have been some examples of that. And not that long ago, there were even some examples of companies that were not handling bodies properly or with respect. So the brain is a different matter. First of all the recoveries are always done through the back of the head out of respect, even if somebody's going to be cremated. You know, this is something that needs to be done the right way. The brain itself has to be very carefully handled in order to be viable for research. So once it's recovered, it has to be stored properly, shipped properly, and then stored for long-term properly, or else it's not usable. You know, not only is it precious, it's fragile in many ways. So, you know, I guess the best insurance of that is knowing that it wouldn't be usable if it wasn't handled properly. And that really requires that to happen. Since the since the procedure itself usually happens in a funeral home, it follows the protocols of how they're handling the body, and then the body is released to the funeral home. But, they got to handle it carefully or they can't use it. And what a waste would that be?
Right. Thank you. Next question. Is there an age cutoff? The slide went fast. I couldn't see.
That's
I'll
a
post
good
the slides.
question. Oh, sorry about that. Yeah, that's a good question too. The answer is no. So older people, especially older people with healthy brains, so older controls are, really valuable for studies on healthy aging. I got to hold the brain of a 90-plus-year-old man one time, and it was a brain that was just used for these demo purposes. The family consented to that for reasons I don't really know, but that's what happened. And so it was interesting to see that it was larger than was typical for the brain of a person that age, because there's usually shrinkage. And the man was very astute, they said, up until his time of death. So that's kind of fascinating. But so whether diseased or not diseased, the older end of things is still very valuable. And then the younger end is so critical. I think I had on the slide that we had some brains from, babies that just were a few months old. And that is like the most generous of things. I mean, if you put yourself in the shoes of the parents who make that decision at a time when they are just horrified, or, it's tragic as hell. There are also women and their partners who have made arrangements knowing they will deliver a baby that will not be viable, knowing that an anomaly has been detected in utero, that when the baby is delivered, it won't live. And they often prearrange, for should that happen quickly, they want to make sure we're able to do it. And that is like an incredible gift of science. So yeah, the bottom line answer is no age range, and also no shelf life for donated brains. There are still brains that were stored back in the 50s, when this kind of viable brain donation was kind of in its infancy, and they're still viable. Our methods for storing and other things related to studying them have advanced quite significantly, in those 75 years or whatever, but they're still good. It's not like, oh, this one's going to be expired. It's not. So
Great. Good to
yeah.
know. Thank you. All right, next question. Is there something that is added to driver's licenses to indicate brain donor?
There's not yet. And that's because it's not part of organ donation. I do think it'd be fabulous if it became part of it, that you could opt in or opt out of the organ donation, have your brain be part of that, but that is not the case at this point. Organ or brain donation is just not a standard part of it, generally speaking. And so until and unless that happens, we have to go with a separate registration. And that's what's so challenging. If it was part of that, it'd be easy. That structure's out there. They know, everybody knows how to talk about it. Everybody knows why, blah, 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 but it's not. So not yet. We'll see.
We'll see.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks for organizing this awareness event. What type of researchers are getting conducted using what type of research is getting conducted using donated brains? Are they used as a cadaver for anatomical education to medical students or something more?
So this kind of brain donation that we're talking about, it's the brain is removed from the body and sent to a brain bank. That's entirely for neurologic research, entirely. That's for inclusion in the Neurobiobanks portals so that neuroscience researchers can look for the tissue that would be applicable to their study. If a body donation program or an anatomical donation program will only accept the body if the brain is, if it's intact, and a lot of them do make that stipulation, that brain is not being used for neuroscience, but it would be used in that case for anatomic study. So they would be allowing students and other people as part of the anatomy lab to touch that brain, maybe to understand the different parts of it. But in that case, it's not used for neuroscience research. All the brains that the banks of the NIH, the Neurobiobank, that's all used for neuroscience research. So yeah, that's a good question.
Great. All right, next question. Do you have experience working with OPOs to recover brains for research from specific donor groups? If so, do you have any recommendations for effectively linking individual OPOs with the NIH Neurobiobank centers, and how disease-focused foundations can facilitate this process?
That's a very key question, and it goes along with the organ donation topic. OPOs are organ procurement organizations. They're called like Donate Life in some parts of the country. There are different ones that operate in different geographies. So there are, in some limited areas, some OPOs that work very closely with brain donation programs, and it's a nice partnership when it happens. For example, at one of the Neurobiobank locations, there is an OPO that operates out of the same building as the brain donation program. And so they've developed kind of a close relationship. The OPOs are notified when someone who's on the national organ donor list would pass, so that they can go and talk to the family and do what needs to be done. And there are times when the organs of a person wouldn't be viable for transplant, so the OPO would generally not be involved in that. But because they have a good relationship, the OPO will sometimes inform the brain donor, the brain bank there, that look, we can't use these organs, but maybe you can use the brain. Do you want us to ask about it, or do you want to go ask about it? And that's fantastic when that happens, that kind of cooperation, because it really advances a lot of things. It also, if you think about donor intent, that person intended to donate their organs to science, right? If their organs aren't usable, and that happens a lot of the time, because you have to die in a certain way for your organs to be viable, and you need to be put on a ventilator to keep them, and that's counter practical for brain donation. But anyway, that donor intended to leave something for science. So often that's a comfort to the family to say, well, he couldn't be an organ donor, but it turns out that we could take the brain and use that. That certainly seems to satisfy donor intent in a way that might make everybody happy.
Great, thank you. Okay, if an adult is incapable of making decisions due to disease and you have power of attorney, is the caregiver allowed to donate the patient brain? Or not,
Yes.
since the person did not give their own permission since no longer capable?
Yeah, that's a really good question too, because I'd like it to make it really clear that yes, a lot of times the family might not think about this until the person is incapacitated and can't make their decisions on their own. That was our situation. My dad wanted to be a body donor, and we knew that, but it wasn't until we started trying to understand Lewy body's dementia, because we didn't know about that. And brain donation kept coming up, and we're like, wow, we should probably think about that, because that's something that he would want. And we had to do that on his behalf. So yes, it's very, very doable for a family to make that decision. In fact, in the pre-registration form that's on our website, the very first question is, are you doing this on behalf of yourself or someone else? The second question is something to the effect of, are we in a hurry? And then the rest of it is just, mainly contact information. So yeah, it doesn't even need to be, I might have mentioned this before, it doesn't even need to be the POA or the medical, the person who handles the medical directives. It's just next of kin can start this and then give final consent over the phone. So yeah, very, very possible to do this on behalf of a family member.
Got it. I think we only have time for one last question.
Okay.
Can you talk more about what research is being done with the brain tissue? You talked about dementia. What other disease states are being looked at?
So it's a lot. it's pretty much name a neurologic disorder. And, you know, when I mentioned that we have over 200 categories of neurologic disease that have been reportedly, reported in the people who pre-register, that's a lot. And so it's everything from the dementias to epilepsy, sleep disorders, and the serious mental illnesses, the schizophrenia and bipolar and treatment-resistant depression. It's clear that there is a huge need for all of us to get to more answers for what devastates families when one family member is suffering a serious mental illness. Finding those biomarkers or the medical markers and reasons and evidence of what's causing that genetically or otherwise is so critical. So, while we tell people, yes, you can get a copy of the neuropath report that tells you exactly what was going on inside your loved one's brain. If you want to know the kind of research that's being supported, the Neurobiobank's website, which is at neurobiobank.nih.gov, I think we put it up there previously. There's an area on there where you can go in and search by disease and see what sort of findings there have been lately using donated brain tissue. Scientists who use it and publish are required to make sure it gets posted there so that other scientists can build on those findings.
Well, thank you so much, Tish, for this amazing discussion. It's been so informative, and I'm sure we're going to have a couple more registrations on that list after we're done.
I hope so. Thank you, Sam. This has been an awesome opportunity, and thanks everyone for joining in. Really appreciate the chance to talk about this.
Absolutely. Well, thank you to our audience for joining us today, and I'm going to actually let Jacqueline tell everyone about our next discussion. But again, wonderful discussion. So happy to have you here, and thank you for the amazing work that you're doing.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Great. So, I'd like to let everyone know about our Alliance discussion next week. Please join us on Wednesday, April 12th at 2 p.m. Our guest speaker is Mary Pittman. She's the CEO of Public Health Institute. I'm dropping the registration link in the chat now. Dr. Pittman will discuss what good data really looks like in the context of public health research, tools and approaches to make data more precise, and how social determinants of health and other community-informed measures provide critical context to make public health data and the research that comes from it more meaningful and actionable. Thanks again for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you again. Thanks, Tish and Sam. Have a great rest of your day. Bye.
Thanks, Tish.